You think of someone you haven't spoken to in years, and your phone rings. It's them. You dream about a specific symbol, and the next morning it appears in the most unlikely place. You make an impossible decision, the kind that has no logical answer, and then three unrelated events line up in perfect sequence, as if reality itself is confirming what you chose. You tell yourself it's just coincidence, random noise in a chaotic universe. But something deeper in you doesn't believe that. Something in you has always suspected these moments mean something, that they're not accidents at all. Carl Jung spent decades investigating that suspicion, and what he discovered didn't just challenge the scientific worldview of his time, it fundamentally redefined the relationship between the human psyche and the fabric of reality itself. Jung didn't arrive at this idea casually. He resisted it for years. As a trained psychiatrist, he understood how dangerous it was to suggest that the external world could mirror internal psychological states in ways that had no causal explanation. His colleagues would call it magical thinking. His reputation would suffer. But the evidence kept accumulating in his practice, patient after patient, year after year, until he could no longer deny what he was observing. Certain events clustered together in ways that defied probability, and these clusters weren't random. They carried meaning, specific, personal, psychologically precise meaning that connected directly to what was happening inside the person experiencing them. He called this phenomenon synchronicity, and it became one of the most controversial, most misunderstood, and most quietly powerful ideas in the history of psychology. Not because it was mystical, but because it suggested something about consciousness that Western science had no framework to accommodate. That the boundary between your inner world and the outer world is far thinner than anyone wants to admit. That at certain critical moments in psychological development, the universe doesn't just sit passively around you, it responds. Today I'm going to show you what Jung actually meant by synchronicity, why it has nothing to do with the watered-down version the spiritual marketplace has turned it into, how it connects directly to the deepest layers of your unconscious mind, and why understanding this concept correctly could change how you navigate every major transition in your life. To understand synchronicity, you first have to understand what it isn't, because the modern spiritual world has taken Jung's concept and turned it into something he would barely recognize. People throw the word around to describe any pleasant coincidence. They find a parking spot and call it synchronicity. They see the same number repeated and post about it online. They experience something mildly surprising and declare the universe is sending them a message. Jung would have been horrified by this, not because he was elitist about it, but because trivializing the concept destroys its actual power and obscures what it's really pointing to. Jung defined synchronicity with surgical precision. It was a meaningful coincidence between an internal psychological state and an external event, where there is no causal relationship between them, but the connection carries significance that's impossible to dismiss. Every word in that definition matters. Meaningful, internal state, external event, no causal relationship, impossible to dismiss. If any of those elements are missing, it's not synchronicity, it's just coincidence. The internal psychological state is critical. Jung found that genuine synchronicities didn't happen randomly throughout someone's life. They clustered around moments of intense psychological activity, periods of transformation, crises, breakthroughs, moments when the unconscious was churning with material that demanded conscious attention. The synchronistic event arrived precisely when the psyche was reaching a threshold, as if the external world was responding to an internal pressure that had built to a breaking point. Jung's most famous example involved a patient who was stuck, intellectually brilliant, highly rational, defended against anything that couldn't be logically explained. She'd been in analysis for weeks, making no progress because her rigid rationality blocked access to her unconscious material. During one session, she was describing a dream about a golden scarab beetle. At that exact moment, Jung heard a tapping at the window. He opened it, and a rose chafer beetle, the closest thing to a golden scarab in that climate, flew into the room. He caught it and handed it to her. The experience shattered her rational framework just enough for the analysis to finally break through. This wasn't a cute coincidence. Jung understood it as the unconscious mind and the external world participating in the same event simultaneously. The beetle didn't fly in because she was talking about it. There was no causal mechanism. But the timing, the specificity, and the psychological precision of the event were so exact that dismissing it as random required more faith than accepting it as meaningful. Jung spent years collecting these cases. A patient dreams of a specific image and encounters it physically the next day in a context that couldn't have been predicted. Someone reaches a psychological crisis point, and an external event occurs that mirrors the internal conflict with disturbing accuracy. A person is struggling with a decision they can't make consciously, and then reality arranges itself in a pattern that illuminates the answer the unconscious already knows. What disturbed Jung wasn't that these things happened occasionally. It was how consistently they happened during specific psychological conditions. Synchronicities appeared most frequently during three circumstances. First, when someone was approaching a major psychological breakthrough and their conscious mind was resisting it. Second, during periods of deep individuation when the ego was being forced to confront material from the collective unconscious. And third, at moments of genuine crisis, where the old psychological structure was dying and the new one hadn't yet formed. This pattern told Jung something profound. Synchronicity wasn't random magic sprinkled across life. It was a phenomenon intimately tied to the unconscious mind's activity. The more intensely the unconscious was working, the more likely synchronistic events were to occur. As if the unconscious didn't just operate inside the skull, as if it extended outward, touching the material world in ways that rational science couldn't explain, but that kept happening anyway. To make sense of this, Jung turned to his concept of the collective unconscious. He'd already established that beneath every individual's personal unconscious lay a deeper layer shared by all human beings. This layer contained archetypes, universal patterns of meaning that organized human experience across cultures and centuries. Jung proposed that synchronicity occurred when an archetype was activated so powerfully in someone's psyche that it manifested not just internally as dreams and emotions, but externally as events in the physical world. This was the radical claim, not that coincidences were meaningful, which is relatively tame, but that the psyche and the physical world share a common substrate, that at the deepest level, mind and matter aren't separate systems running in parallel. They're expressions of the same underlying reality, and when something erupts from the collective unconscious with enough force, it ripples outward into both psychological experience and physical events simultaneously. Jung collaborated with physicist Wolfgang Pauli on this idea, which tells you he wasn't operating from spiritual fantasy. Pauli was a Nobel laureate, one of the founders of quantum mechanics, and Pauli recognized in Jung's synchronicity something that quantum physics was also pointing toward, that at the deepest level of reality, the clean separation between observer and observed, between inner experience and outer event, breaks down. The universe isn't the dead mechanical clockwork that 19th century science described. Something stranger is happening, something that neither physics nor psychology alone can fully account for. But here's where most people go wrong with synchronicity, and where Jung would push back hardest against the modern spiritual interpretation. Synchronicity is not the universe rewarding you. It's not a cosmic thumbs up confirming your desires. It's not manifestation. It's not the law of attraction. And it's not a sign that you're on the right path because something pleasant happened at a convenient time. Jung was explicit about this. Synchronicities are often deeply unsettling. They can confirm your worst fears as easily as your deepest hopes. They don't arrive to make you feel good. They arrive because something in the unconscious demands attention, and reality conspires to force that attention whether you want it or not. A synchronistic event can just as easily point you toward a truth you've been avoiding as toward a truth you've been seeking. It's not a reward system, it's a meaning system. And meaning isn't always comfortable. This distinction matters because people who treat synchronicity as cosmic validation start seeing it everywhere. Every coincidence becomes a sign. Every repeated number becomes a message. Every unexpected event becomes the universe confirming their choices. And this creates a kind of psychological inflation, where the ego takes credit for what are actually autonomous expressions of the unconscious. You're not creating synchronicities through positive thinking. The unconscious is producing them through processes you don't control and can't manufacture. Jung warned specifically against this inflation. When someone starts believing they can summon synchronicities, or that synchronicities prove they're special or chosen, they've fallen into what he would have called identification with the self. They've confused their ego with the deeper organizing principle of the psyche. And that confusion doesn't lead to enlightenment, it leads to grandiosity, disconnection from reality, and eventually psychological collapse when reality stops performing on command. The honest relationship with synchronicity is more humble and more powerful. You notice when meaningful coincidences occur. You pay attention to what internal state they correspond to. You treat them as data from the unconscious rather than gifts from the universe. And you use them to deepen your self-understanding rather than to inflate your sense of cosmic importance. And if this idea resonates with you, if you've been sensing that your inner world and outer world are connected in ways no one around you seems to acknowledge, then there's something that might help you explore that connection more deliberately. We've put together a guide called True Self-Discovery, with 24 practical reflection exercises drawn from Jung's teachings, designed to help you find your way within. Because synchronicity doesn't respond to wishful thinking, it responds to genuine inner work. The link is below. Now here's where Jung's understanding of synchronicity gets genuinely profound, and where it connects to something most people never consider. Jung didn't think synchronicity was just an interesting anomaly. He believed it revealed something fundamental about how consciousness develops. Specifically, he found that synchronicities intensified dramatically during individuation, his term for the process of becoming psychologically whole. Individuation isn't self-improvement. It's not becoming a better version of yourself. It's the painful, often terrifying process of integrating everything you've rejected, denied, and suppressed about your own psyche. The shadow material, the parts of yourself you consider unacceptable, the emotions you've buried, the truths you've avoided. Individuation means bringing all of that into consciousness and learning to hold it without being destroyed by it. And Jung observed that the deeper someone went into this process, the more the external world seemed to participate in their transformation, as if reality itself recognized the psychological work being done and responded to it. Patients in deep individuation would report not just occasional coincidences, but clusters of synchronistic events that seem to mirror and guide the internal process with startling precision. Someone working to integrate their shadow, for instance, might suddenly encounter the very person who embodies what they've been repressing. Not because they sought that person out, the encounter just happens. And it happens at exactly the moment when the unconscious material is ready to surface. The timing is too specific to dismiss. The meaning is too personal to ignore. Or someone approaching a breakthrough and understanding their family patterns might receive a letter, a phone call, or discover a photograph at precisely the moment when the pattern becomes conscious for the first time. The external event doesn't cause the breakthrough, but it arrives in perfect concert with it, as if inner realization and outer event are two expressions of the same underlying movement. Jung theorized that this happened because individuation isn't just a personal process. It's a process that involves the collective unconscious, which by its nature extends beyond the individual psyche. When you're doing deep psychological work, you're touching layers of reality that aren't contained inside your skull. You're engaging with archetypal patterns that exist in the collective unconscious, and those patterns have both psychological and material expressions. So when an archetype activates fully, you experience it internally as insight, emotion, or transformation. And the world around you expresses the same archetype as event, encounter, or circumstance. This is what made synchronicity so important to Jung. It wasn't a parlor trick or a curiosity. It was evidence that consciousness and the material world arise from a shared source. That the deepest layer of your psyche isn't separate from the world you inhabit. That when you change internally at the deepest levels, the external world shifts in response. Not magically, not because you're manifesting, but because at the level of archetypes and the collective unconscious, inner and outer were never separate to begin with. Now this has implications that most people aren't ready to face. Because if synchronicity is real in the way Jung described it, then the modern worldview that treats consciousness as a byproduct of brain chemistry and the material world is fundamentally separate from subjective experience is incomplete. Something is operating beneath both mind and matter that connects them in ways science hasn't yet mapped. And that something isn't supernatural. It's the natural order operating at a depth that Western rationalism hasn't been willing to explore. Jung was careful about this. He wasn't anti-science. He wasn't promoting mysticism. He was pointing out that the scientific worldview had artificially narrowed reality to what could be measured causally, and in doing so had made certain observable phenomena invisible. Synchronicity couldn't be studied through causal analysis because it wasn't causal. The external event didn't cause the internal state. The internal state didn't cause the external event. They arose together from something beneath both. And that beneath, that shared origin, was what Jung spent the second half of his career trying to understand. He used the term unus mundus, borrowed from medieval philosophy. One world, a unified reality beneath the apparent duality of mind and matter. Jung proposed that at the deepest level, psyche and matter are aspects of the same unified field, and synchronicity is what happens when that unity becomes visible, when the membrane between inner and outer grows thin enough that you can see the connection operating in real time. This is why synchronicities feel so uncanny. They violate the assumption you've been taught since childhood, that your inner life is contained in your head and the outer world operates independently. When a synchronistic event occurs, it shatters that assumption momentarily. You experience, just for an instant, the reality that inner and outer aren't separate. That meaning doesn't only exist inside consciousness. It exists in the fabric of events themselves. And for most people, that moment of seeing is both thrilling and profoundly disorienting. Jung also discovered something about synchronicity that rarely gets discussed. He found that people who systematically ignored or dismissed synchronistic events tended to have them increase in intensity, as if the unconscious, unable to get its message through the normal channels of dreams and intuition because the person was too defended to listen, escalated its efforts by producing external events that were harder to dismiss. Think about someone who's been ignoring a deep truth about their life. Maybe they're in a relationship that's dying, but they refuse to see it. Maybe they're in a career that's violating their values, but they keep pushing through. Maybe they're carrying a wound that's been demanding attention for decades, but they've built their entire identity around avoiding it. Jung observed that in these cases, the unconscious didn't just wait patiently, it pushed harder. Dreams became more vivid and disturbing, emotional symptoms intensified, and synchronistic events appeared with increasing frequency and undeniable clarity, as if reality itself was trying to shake the person awake. Someone avoiding the truth about their relationship might suddenly encounter the same theme everywhere. A conversation overheard in a cafe that mirrors their situation exactly. A book that falls open to a passage about the precise dynamic they're living. A friend who tells a story so similar to their own that pretending it's irrelevant becomes impossible. These aren't accidents. They're the collective unconscious, operating through the shared substrate of reality, producing events that match the psychological truth the person is refusing to face. And when someone finally stops resisting, when they finally turn toward the material the unconscious has been trying to surface, the synchronicities shift. They stop being confrontational and become confirmatory. Not in the shallow sense of cosmic reward, but in the deeper sense of alignment. The inner movement and the outer events begin to flow in the same direction. Doors open not because the universe is granting wishes, but because the person has finally aligned their conscious choices with what the unconscious has been trying to communicate all along. Jung would have called this alignment with the self, the deeper organizing principle of the psyche that includes but vastly exceeds the ego. When the ego stops fighting the self's direction, when conscious choice aligns with unconscious wisdom, the result looks from the outside like supernatural luck. Opportunities appear, right people arrive, circumstances arrange themselves favorably. But it's not luck, it's the natural consequence of psychological alignment, of no longer being at war with your own depths. This is also why synchronicities often increase during the most painful periods of transformation. When your old identity is dissolving, when everything you thought you knew is collapsing, when you feel most lost and most terrified, that's when the unconscious is most active. That's when the deepest archetypal patterns are reorganizing, and that's when the boundary between psyche and world grows thinnest. If you're in one of those periods right now, if reality seems to be speaking to you in ways that feel impossible but undeniable, Jung would tell you that you're not losing your mind. You're losing your old mind, and what's trying to emerge through these synchronistic events is the new psychological structure that's forming beneath the rubble of the old one. But he'd also warn you against two dangerous responses. The first is inflation, believing that synchronicities make you special or that you can control them. The moment you try to force synchronicity, to manufacture it, to use it as proof of your spiritual superiority, you've lost the plot entirely. Synchronicity isn't about you being chosen, it's about reality being more interconnected than you realized. The correct response is humility, not pride. The second dangerous response is literalism, interpreting every coincidence as a direct instruction from the universe. Jung was clear that synchronicities aren't commands. They're not telling you what to do. They're reflecting what's happening in your unconscious. The meaning isn't in the event itself. It's in the relationship between the event and your inner state. A synchronistic event is a mirror, not a map. It shows you where you are psychologically. It doesn't give you step-by-step directions for what to do next. The mature response to synchronicity, the one Jung spent decades developing, is reflective attention. You notice the meaningful coincidence. You examine what internal state it corresponds to. You ask what the unconscious might be processing that could produce this particular external mirror. And then you sit with the meaning, without rushing to act on it. You let the synchronistic event deepen your self-understanding, rather than using it to make impulsive decisions. This is harder than it sounds, because synchronistic events often carry such emotional charge that the impulse to act immediately feels overwhelming. You experience a powerful coincidence related to a relationship, and you want to call them right now. You encounter a synchronistic event connected to a career change, and you want to quit your job tomorrow. But Jung would counsel patience. The synchronistic event is telling you something about your unconscious state. It's not necessarily telling you to take action. Sometimes the action it calls for is internal, more reflection, more integration, more willingness to sit with what's emerging before you act on it. And here's perhaps the most important thing Jung understood about synchronicity that almost nobody discusses. He found that the capacity to perceive synchronistic events was itself a marker of psychological development. People who were heavily identified with their ego, heavily defended against the unconscious, heavily invested in the rational materialist worldview, simply couldn't perceive synchronicities even when they occurred. They'd experience the meaningful coincidence and immediately explain it away. Just random chance, just confirmation bias, just pattern recognition gone haywire. But people who had done significant inner work, who had developed a conscious relationship with their unconscious, who had loosened the ego's stranglehold on what counted as real, these people perceived synchronicities with increasing frequency and depth, not because more synchronicities were occurring in their lives, but because they'd developed the perceptual capacity to recognize them. The events were always there. The meaning was always present. But perceiving that meaning required a consciousness that had expanded beyond the ego's narrow filter. This is why Jung connected synchronicity directly to individuation. The more you integrate your shadow, the more you develop a relationship with the unconscious. The more you loosen your identification with ego and persona, the more you begin to perceive the meaningful connections between your inner life and external events. Synchronicity isn't something that happens to special people. It's something that becomes visible as consciousness deepens. And that deepening doesn't happen through wishing or believing. It happens through the slow, painful, honest work of becoming psychologically whole. Jung spent the final decades of his life exploring these ideas, and he never claimed to have them fully figured out. He knew he was pointing towards something that exceeded the current framework of both science and psychology. He knew his colleagues would dismiss synchronicity as mysticism. He knew the spiritual marketplace would eventually co-opt it and turn it into something trivial. But he published his findings anyway, because the evidence was too consistent and too important to suppress. What Jung ultimately believed was that synchronicity is a window into the true nature of reality. Not the mechanical, causally determined reality that Western science describes, but a deeper reality where meaning is woven into the structure of existence itself. where the human psyche and the material world participate in a shared order that becomes visible at moments of psychological intensity, where the apparent separation between your inner life and the outer world is an illusion maintained by the ego's need for control and the rational mind's demand for causal explanation. When that illusion thins, when the ego's grip loosens, when you're deep enough in transformation that the defenses come down, you begin to see what was always there: the connections, the meaning, the impossible precision of events that mirror your innermost psychological states. And seeing this doesn't make you mystical or delusional. It makes you, in Jung's view, more conscious, more aware of the actual fabric of reality than the narrow causal worldview allows. If you've been experiencing these meaningful coincidences, if reality has been arranging itself around your inner process in ways that feel too specific to be accidental, Jung would tell you to pay attention. Not with inflation or grandiosity, not with the belief that you're special or chosen, but with humility and curiosity. Something in the depths of your psyche is active, something is trying to surface, and reality is participating in that surfacing in ways that your rational mind will try to dismiss, but that a deeper part of you recognizes as true. Trust that recognition, not blindly, not recklessly, but with the quiet confidence of someone who's learning to perceive at a level that most people deny exists. Your inner world and your outer world aren't as separate as you were taught. The meaning you sense in those impossible coincidences isn't imagined, and the fact that you can perceive it at all tells you something important about the depth of psychological work your consciousness is already doing, whether you realize it or not. That's what Jung spent his life trying to tell us. Not that we live in a magical universe that rewards positive thinking, but that we live in a meaningful universe where psyche and matter share roots so deep that they sometimes surface together in ways that shatter the illusion of separation. Synchronicity isn't proof that the universe loves you. It's proof that reality is more interconnected, more layered, and more responsive to consciousness than the modern world has been willing to admit. And learning to perceive that interconnection, with humility, with reflection, with genuine inner work rather than wishful thinking, is one of the most profound things a human being can do. Jung never stopped being a scientist about this. He never abandoned rigor for romance. But he also never allowed the limitations of the current scientific framework to make him deny what he observed with his own eyes, in his own practice, across thousands of encounters with the human psyche. Synchronicity was real, it was meaningful, it was connected to the deepest processes of psychological transformation, and dismissing it as coincidence required ignoring more evidence than accepting it as something extraordinary. You don't have to understand how it works to notice when it's happening. You don't have to have a theory about the relationship between psyche and matter to pay attention when reality mirrors your inner state with uncanny precision. You just have to be willing to see it, to let the experience in without immediately explaining it away, to sit with the strangeness of a meaningful coincidence and ask what it might be reflecting about your own psychological depth. Because that willingness to see, that openness to meaning operating beneath the surface of random events, is itself the beginning of a more conscious life. Not a more magical life, not a life where you manifest parking spots and interpret every repeated number as divine communication, but a life where you're awake to the connections between your inner world and the world around you, where you treat your psychological development as something that matters not just to you, but to the reality you inhabit, where you recognize that becoming more conscious isn't just a personal project, it's a participation in something vast that Jung barely had the language to describe, but that he knew, with the certainty of someone who'd spent a lifetime observing, was absolutely real. If you haven't yet, there's a guide we've created called True Self-Discovery, built around 24 reflection exercises rooted in Jung's work, designed to help you find your way within. Because everything Jung discovered about synchronicity points back to the same truth. The deeper you go into yourself, the more clearly you see how the inner world and the outer world have been speaking to each other all along. The link is below.